Good morning. As it always is, it's such a great joy to be here and to be back here one more time. Today I'd like to take you on a little bit of a journey in my life. And that journey it's really what the title of this is today. It's from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. And it's really where God has taken me in my own life. And it's very important for you that are out there that are listening and possibly watching on the live stream to begin to identify even yourself with what was going on in my own life, because I know I'm not alone here, what I went through and what I'm going through. I know there's many of you that are in the same position, and hopefully sharing with you today will actually begin to help you come out of what I began to come out. I want to start reading with Ezekiel 36, because it's the very, center of what, I'm going to talk about. In verse 26 and 27, it says, "A new heart will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I'll take away the stony heart out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh." That tenderness of heart. It's something that was long coming in my life. I grew up in Allentown. I grew up on a street called Auburn Street. Not that that would matter to any of you, but it matters to me. And I grew up, it was not the best part of town. It was down by the railroad tracks. It was by all the warehouses and factories at that time. It was a rough part of town, and I would hang out at the little pavilion there. There was a park there, and I was a little guy. I don't look like I could have ever possibly been a little guy, but I was a little guy at that point in my life. And so I would go over there, and like it is today, but it's much worse today. But even then, that whole bullying and that whole pushing and, everybody trying to establish themselves that they were more king than the other guy. And I remember when I was that little guy, and I go over there, and I was younger than many of them, and, they began to push on you, and this is where I really began to understand I needed to push back. Now, not that I did in the sense of God, but that's what I knew. In order to survive in the midst of this, I needed to push back. And that pushback would come many times, and the pushback would basically sometimes break into a fight. And when that fight would happen, I would keep fighting. Even though I was getting beat up, I would keep fighting. I wouldn't stop. And that began to build that hardness of heart. That began to build that strong will. I'm losing, but I'm not stopping. I mean, it would probably frustrate those people, because I wouldn't stop. I wouldn't do it. And when you grow up, and when you're in the midst, it's not just even growing up. It's like when you're in the midst of a lot of people, and they're not good people, and you're in the midst of circumstances or areas, that they're not good for you. And that's where I lived. I was so affected by it. I was so, brought to a place that my heart just kept getting harder and harder and harder. I also remember those times when, sports, I played a lot of sports. It wasn't all organized sports. And back in those days, you did a lot of what you call sandlot sports. You basically played football in a sandlot. There were no pads. There were no nothing. Or you did it up, wherever at the local hill. But it was always very aggressive. There was never refs. There was nothing. So there was a whole lot of pushing and shoving going on. And some of it wasn't always that legal. And there was always a lot of, just things that were happening. And I remember then, I did a lot of I carried the ball out. I did a lot of running. And so I always would just give over to this stuff. And later in life, I began to understand I used to give over to demons. I used to just give myself so much that, it would be, I'd feel that adrenaline. And, it was like I almost made myself believe that nothing could stop me. I'm going through that line. I'm going to do whatever it takes. And, and that began to build more and more and more hardness, more and more strong will. And I'm sure many of you out there today, you've gotten to that place in your own lives. I mean, you've done the same things. You've given to that frustration and decided, well, I'm going to push through it. I didn't have Jesus. You may not have Jesus, or you may have Jesus and you're pushing beyond it anyway. But you need to start looking at it. You need to listen to what I'm saying here because it's very important. Because the devil has a plan. And that plan is basically to destroy you. That plan for me was to destroy me. To get me to that place where, I was so hard and so not caring that I would do anything. And a lot of you, that's what's happening in your lives. And you can't understand. You feel that drive. You feel that you can't find peace anywhere. That's what we're talking about here. I remember one time I was in gym class, and I don't even like talking about it because when I look back, I don't know who that Ray Nino was, truthfully. I don't know who he was, but we were playing touch football, and we were outside with a gym teacher, and I was on the line at that time. There was this younger guy. I think I was, I might have been a senior by that point in time. There was this younger guy that kept wanting, to get past me. I mean, this was touch football. We're just playing gym. And I think he thought it was the Super Bowl or something, But it would just press up against me. I just didn't like his attitude. Then all of a sudden, one time he came rushing me, and I started hitting him with my elbows. I basically took him out. And he laid on the ground. And the gym teacher came up to me and says, I'm not going to mess with you. It was a sad time now when I look back and I see that. And I think of what I had become. That hardness was just going more and more and more. And I didn't know Jesus. I went to church. My parents did the best they could, the most they knew. But the surroundings and the people, that's the way they lived. That's how I became. That's how I survived. I learned to survive. That hardness of a heart was my survival. But that was the devil's plan because he wanted me to have a hard heart so I never would see the love of God. So I left home when I was 18 years old. And that's, first, I want to go back to that because that's very important. Many of you have a hard heart, and the devil has accommodated you to have that hard heart so that you would also not see the love of God when it began to come. But I left home when I was 18 years old. I got in trouble. And because I got in trouble, I got sent to Vietnam. I was so scared. But you don't act scared. You got a hard heart. You're too proud to act scared. But listen, I was shaking in my boots, literally. I mean, I'd lay in my bed at night and you'd hear small arms fire. You'd see the flares shooting out. It was almost like, where am I? What am I doing here? And it was so bad. And so what you begin to do, you get drunk every night. You get off work and you go to the club and get drunk. It was an airman's club there. I was on an air base. Or you began to do drugs, and then you do more drugs. Then you do mind-altering drugs, which were available at that point in time. And before you know it, you've pretty well taken yourself out of the circumstances, and your hard heart is keeping you where you need to be so you don't feel anything at that moment in time. Yet, it's still all there. You've never dealt with it. After Vietnam, I went to Hawaii. And it didn't get better, it got worse. It got just totally worse. But the whole time I was in the military, I would push back against all the sergeants. I'd push back against the officers. I began that rebellion against the authorities in my life. I would push back. I lost rank. I lost rank several times. I was disciplined many times. And in Vietnam, in order for them to make me feel even worse, they put me on the other side of the base. Well, the other side of the base was where all the rockets came. But it didn't matter. I was tough. I was hard. It was a sad thing. But in that whole process, I just so disrespected authority. I just could never rise above it. And that's who I had become. And Paul in Ephesians, he states it quite well. In Ephesians 4:17, he says, and this is really, he's talking to you and he's talking to me at this point as well, about this. Because, I'm still walking out many of it. I've had great changes. But this is what he says to us. So he says, so this I say, and I solemnly testify in the name of the Lord, as in his presence, that you must no longer live as a heathen. The Gentiles do this in perverseness, in the folly, in the vanity and emptiness of their souls, and the futility of their minds. That's what I had become. Empty. The emptiness of my soul. I was a shell of a man. I was nothing. I had no feelings. Very little affected me. I had shut it all out. It was futility of my mind. Their mortal, it goes on, it says, their moral understanding is darkened and their reason is beclouded. They're alienated, they're estranged, they're self-banished from the life of God with no share in it. This is because of the ignorance, the want of knowledge and perception, the willful blindness that is deep-seated in them, because it is due to the hardness of their heart, to the insensitivity of their moral soul. That's what I'd become. And it says this further. He says, in their spiritual apathy, they've become callous, past feeling. We were past having any feeling, reckless, having abandoned themselves, a prey. What is it, a prey? A prey to the devil's plan. This is what he wanted. It says a prey to what? Unbridled sensuality. Eager and greedy to indulge in every form of impurity that their depraved desires may suggest and demand. That was me. I was ravaged by the unclean. And, I was ravaged by pornography. That was my life. I lived for it. I lived for it on a daily basis. I lived for those moments. I look back now. During the time, you don't think that way. But I did then. I was ravaged. And many of you, you're there as well. You're right there. You're hopeless. But I'm trying to give you hope here today. Jesus is hope. And that's what we're talking about here. That's where that heart of stone can become a heart of flesh. And that's where we're going right now. I used to feel, I used to go out at night and I would go down to the worst parts of town. I'd either sell drugs, buy drugs, or give drugs away free. But I'd be walking around in all the perverseness, all around me. And the sad thing was, I felt at home. I felt part of it. It made me feel like I was part of who they were. What a sad case. What a sad case. But again, many of you are the same. Many of you find that peace of what you're looking for, which is really not peace. Hanging out with the wrong people, indulging in the drugs, indulging in doing all the different things that you shouldn't be involved in. Just giving yourself fully to the unclean, fully to the pornography, just doing all the wrong things. But God began to intervene. He began, to get a hold of my life. He began to bring me into an understanding. I know, my mom, she wasn't a real spiritual person in some senses. But later in life, she told me when she knew I was out. And she told me, she said, she would call the prayer tower. She would call the prayer tower out at Oral Roberts. She didn't even know what it was. It wasn't like she was part of that whole movement. She went to a very small religious church, but she would see it on TV. And so she would call the prayer tower, help my son, help my son. And Ezekiel 36 he says this because this is really what began to happen. He says, then, after all this, he says, then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. And again, a new heart will I give you, a new spirit will I put within you. I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. That clean water that was sprinkling on me, that was the love of God. It became, many people, it started to show up in different places, because God wanted to bring me out. The devil wanted to destroy me. He wanted to take me under. He would constantly come back, like he said when he tempted Jesus. He said he'll come back at a more opportune time. And that's what he did. He would keep coming back and coming back and coming back. But God had a plan as well. And that plan was, that water that would come and just start to bring the love of God upon me. I remember my two friends, I was losing it. When I was in Hawaii, I was on so many drugs, so many mind-altering drugs, so much. I had no sense of reality. And truthfully, I was very scared because I thought I was losing my mind. I didn't understand what was going on, and I thought, I got to get back somewhere, at least that there was some stability. So, I moved back from Hawaii to Pennsylvania, where I grew up. I moved back into my mom and dad's home, and but the drugs kept coming. I had learned where to go and how to find the things I needed at that point in time in my life, but they kept coming. But I had two friends, two friends that I grew up with, two friends that truthfully, I did a lot of bad things with. But they came one night and wanted to take me somewhere. They insinuated they were taking me somewhere to go do drugs. And they took me to church. And that night at church, I figured, forget it. They're not going to let me in anyway, the way I looked. There was a man at that door, and he greeted me with such love. So much the love of God. That was the beginning of the sprinkling of that clean water. It started to fall. It started to fall on me. And it went from there. I remember a lot of things, but I remember, I came to North Carolina because I was in the music business afterwards, and there was one of my music groups was here, and I came to North Carolina to see them, and they had pretty much introduced me to this ministry here called Word of Faith Fellowship, and they were here visiting, and that day we got together, and it was their last day, and they were from Sweden, so they wanted to go shopping. So Sam Whaley, the pastor, Jane, his wife, was out of town that weekend. We went together. He wanted, to go together. Well, I didn't really want to shop, and neither did he. And so they did all their shopping, and I don't know how many hours it was. It could have been 8 hours. But we sat in the food court, and all Sam did was open up his heart. It was the clean water that was sprinkling on me. It was penetrating that hard heart. It was penetrating that stony heart. It was starting to come. That was just one time. Then I remember, I hadn't moved here yet. And I remember, it was this love of God, it just so attracted me. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was. And I remember flying to Chicago to a church there. Jane and Carol and Brooke were there. And I just wanted to understand more what was going on. I didn't understand, I wanted to know more. And I remember after we had gone to one of the services, I happened to be staying in the same hotel. And truthfully, women, I love my wife. I love my mom. Beyond that, I didn't have a whole lot of time for women. I was very hard-nosed, hardcore, hard-hearted, and had very little time. Well, we walked back, and they stopped by the room, and I was going to my room, and they all gave me a hug and gave me a kiss on my forehead or cheek. I never had that. I didn't remember. And it wasn't, it was so much the love of God. God was saying, I love you. He was saying, here's more of that clean water that's sprinkling you, Ray. It just kept coming. I remember when we did finally move. We moved to North Carolina, and I received a word from one of the ministers. It was one of those ladies that actually that night had really gave that love of God to me. She said, and the word she gave was like what God gave to Ezekiel in chapter 36 for Israel. It was how he would make the wastelands whole again. I had a lot of wastelands, people. Some of you have a lot of wastelands and lands that have been destroyed by your actions and by what you've done. I had a lot of wasteland. And God was making a promise. And I said, I pray and I hope it to be so. That's what I said. In Deuteronomy, it says, and this is what Deuteronomy 6:4-5. It says, hear, O Israel. I said, hear, O Reinino. The Lord your God is one Lord, the only Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your mind and all your heart and your entire being with all your might. I remember, I started to walk out a relationship with my wife, and I felt we were supposed to be married. But because of that hardness of and that coldness, I had very little emotion still. This was prior to us coming to North Carolina. We lived in Nashville, Tennessee. Well, I first lived in North Carolina and then moved to Nashville, Tennessee. But we were together for 6 years before we got married. In the 6 years, a large part of that reasoning while we were there, why it took 6 years was that hardness. Was that hardness in my heart. Obviously, she was apprehensive. I couldn't show emotion. I couldn't show feeling. It was like you would hear smile for the camera. And I think I'm smiling, and I'm not smiling at all. All was there was hardness. And he says again in Luke, and he replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and with all your mind, and neighbor as yourself. Well, it was difficult for me to love my neighbor as myself because I truly didn't love myself. I was shameful of myself. That's what that uncleanness had so done in me. It has caused me to be full of guilt, full of shame. And plus, I couldn't give my heart because I had given my heart to so many other things. So how could I love God with all my heart and love my neighbor as myself? I didn't have a hold of my heart. My self-will was gone. I'd given my will. I'd given my will to devils. I'd given my will, to that hardness. And he said, little children, keep yourself from idols. from anything and everything that would occupy the place in your heart due to God. From the sort of substitute of him that would take first place in your life. That's basically what had happened. I gave myself to the music. I gave myself to all the unclean. I gave myself to all these things. I didn't have a heart to give. My heart was hard. But God was sprinkling that water. He was cleansing me. He was bringing me to that place. He was doing it. It was doing it with his love. I remember when I came to the church, there would be nonstop deliverance for me. People would pray for me all the time. At times the whole church would pray for me. And again, all I could feel was that cleansing, that clean water, that God sprinkling me with the love of God, the love of God, the love of God. And, I remember my son at one point, he was pretty young back then, but still there were some things that, he had problems with. Well, I had a difficulty because there was some of the problems he was having I had myself. So I really had no authority to help him, but I watched God send people. They would pray for him every day. That was the love of God. I was watching that love of God. I was watching that love of God help him so he would not grow up like Ray Nino. He would not grow up with that hard heart. He would not grow up learning to push back against things. That was the love of God. That was the real love of God. There were times they would sing songs and they would sing the song, "Kingdoms of this world have now become the kingdom of God." And that's what was happening to me. That was what was going on. Correction would come. And as it says, in Revelations 3:19, to whom he loves dearly, he tells their faults. And Hebrews 12:5-6 says, have you all complete and forgotten the divine word of God, appeal and encouragement in which you are reasoned with and addressed? He says, do you not think lightly or scorn to submit to correction? For the longest time, I would scorn correction. There were strong words given to me. In Titus, it says, rebuke them sharply, deal sternly, even severely with them, so that they may be sound in the faith and free from error. That was the love of God. That was the sprinkling of the water. Because it came strong, because that hardness was so hard. It had to crack that hardness, that hard rock. And that word would come strong at me. But it always would come with the love of God. It always would come to rain on me in that water, that sprinkling water. I really began to see the fruit come. And it says in Matthew 13:44, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like something precious buried in a field. When a man found it and hid it, then in his joy he goes and sells it all and comes back and buys the field. Truthfully, that's what happened in my life. I left the whole music business, sold it all, and went to where God was meeting me in this church here. We got rid of it all. And in closing, there's so much more I could say, but I'm running out of time. In closing, Ezekiel says, and you shall dwell in that land that I gave your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. I will also save you from all your uncleanness, and I'll call you forth the grain and make it abundant and lay no famine among you. And I'll multiply the fruit of your tree, increase the field, that you may no more suffer the reproach and disgrace of famine among you. But he then says, then you shall earnestly remember your own evil ways and your doings that were no good, and shall loathe yourself in those own sights for your iniquities and for your abominable deeds. I hate the way I was. I despise the way I was. God has given me a heart of flesh. I love the love of God. I am blessed with a family. I love to watch my family. I love to watch the people of the church just dance around the church when, we used to do a song, As David Did. And it is just so refreshing. It's so much that water, the water of God, just falling on me, dealing with all my uncleanness, dealing with all the things. I don't have a hard heart anymore. I'm able to weep. I'm able to care for people. God took the heart of stone and he gave me a heart of flesh. He wants to do the same for you today. Open up your heart. You can come see us any day. Monday, you can come see us any Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 8:30. There'll be lots of my friends here. Come share. Or go to wordoffaithfellowship.org. Many videos there to help you to come out of that hardness of heart. Love you all.